Hello, I'm Ann Godlasky, president of the National Press Foundation, coming to you from our Evelyn Y. Davis studios in Washington, D.C. The National Press Foundation has a mission of making good journalists better through free trainings and paid awards, which we would not be able to provide without our generous sponsors. For NPF's Covering Women in Politics Fellowship, as well as the guidelines and this webinar, we thank Pivotal Ventures for their support. And now I would like to introduce our panelists, or I should say, welcome back to our panelists, because they were all involved in this fellowship in one way or another. Sonya Ross is editor-in-chief of Black Women Unmuted, which she founded after a 33-year career at the Associated Press, where she was their first Black woman White House reporter. For NPF, she's been an awards judge and has also spoken to our Widening the Pipeline Fellows and our Covering Women in Politics Fellows. So thank you for joining us again, Sonya.
Thank you for having me.
I'd also like to welcome Debbie Walsh. She is director of the Center for American Women and Politics at Rutgers University. COP for short is a leading research institute in this area, and they sent several speakers to the fellowship as well. Welcome, Debbie. And Sameea Kamal is an award-winning political reporter for CalMatters, the nonprofit newsroom in California. She was one of 20 fellows who gathered for this fellowship in Washington, D.C. for several days back in April, where the journalists and experts gathered to talk about these topics. And it was from a brainstorm on the final day of the fellowship that these guidelines were born. So the guidelines focused on sourcing, framing, language, and how the different things that journalists do can help or contribute to unbiased reporting on women in politics. So we are sharing the link in the chat to the guidelines if you'd like to reference them, and a reminder to all the folks attending that you can submit questions at any time in the chat or using the Q&A feature, and we will definitely make sure to get to those. So to kick off, I'd like to go to you first, Debbie, if you don't mind. So we know, of course, that guidelines like these covering women candidates and lawmakers fairly is important in terms of journalistic ethics and what we do generally. But can you talk a little bit about the real world impact of how journalism can actually make or break some of these races?
Sure. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. And we at the Center for American Women in Politics have been really pleased to be a part of this work that you're doing. And we're delighted that you're prioritizing this issue of gender bias and how to cover the whole topic of gender and politics, both for campaigns, but also for office holders. This has been a pervasive problem and a challenge that women in politics have faced, and it's been faced by them at every level. It's something they face as candidates, and it's something they face when they are serving. It's been a topic for scholars since the beginning of the work that's been done on women in politics, and it's a challenge that we hear political women talking about as they are working to disrupt the very image of who can lead, and therefore the kind of coverage that is given them can either hinder or help. And so what I'd like to do, I think, a little in this question is to talk about how that has changed a bit over time. So early on, we saw that women actually were getting less coverage and more negative coverage when they ran for office and when they served. It has changed a bit. Things are a bit better. The coverage seems to have equalized out, but we still see disparities in the kind of coverage that women face. The focus is more on appearance, their family situation, personality traits. And we're certainly seeing this issue of family, right? It's coming out in this presidential race. We're hearing the comments about childless, cat-loving women and what it means if you don't have children. It means the notion that you don't have a stake in the future. But we've also seen in the past the challenge that women who do have small children face, which is that, who's taking care of their children. We also see some double standards in that kind of coverage, where women have had to really downplay the fact that they have young children. And for male candidates, that often is celebrated in them. We saw that when in the presidential race in 2020 with Seth Moulton and Eric Swalwell campaigning with children strapped to their fronts, and they were extolled as being such great fathers, whereas we all at the Center for American Women in Politics were thinking, I'm not sure a woman running for president could get away with that. And that comes from this different kind of coverage. All of this really diminishes women candidates and women office holders when they are reduced to their appearance, when they are reduced to certain personality traits. It makes them less than their male colleagues or their male opponents, and it diminishes the seriousness and the seriousness with which they bring to a race or to being an office holder. I want to just give you a couple of examples when I think about this. This excessive focus on image we saw particularly and most vividly with Hillary Clinton. Her clothes, her voice, her smile. I found it very noticeable when she was running against Bernie Sanders, because they would talk about the fact that she was yelling. Why is she yelling so much? We would hear that from political analysts on cable news. Meanwhile, she's running against Bernie Sanders, who, for all intents and purposes, was screaming at us from the screen, that she doesn't smile more. Why isn't she smiling more? These are not questions that are asked of Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump when she was running against either of those men. The kind of imagery that candidates have. So you think about a Bernie Sanders kind of wagging his finger while he speaks. Again, hard to imagine a woman running for office who is able to do that. When Elizabeth Warren was running, she was often described as schoolmarmish. And this was because she had ideas and policy solutions to problems, rather than focusing on the solutions that she was proposing. She was described as schoolmarmish. Think back to the excessive coverage of Amy Klobuchar as being a difficult boss. Hard to imagine that there aren't many men who serve in office who are difficult bosses, but this kind of excessive coverage of that, when you think of in terms of personality, really kind of wipes away the substance that that woman candidate or that woman office holder brings to the table. And these things are even more complex and complicated for women of color, because they are dealing with the sexism and the bias based on gender, as well as the bias based on race. And just a couple of examples, and oftentimes these come from cartoons. So Michelle Obama, the way she was depicted on the cover of the New Yorker magazine as the angry Black woman. Or I don't know if you all remember, but when Nikki Haley was running for governor of South Carolina the first time around, there was quite a vivid cartoon of what is presented to women, to voters of South Carolina, was Nikki Haley as a beauty queen in a bikini, and then what you really get, and then the other drawing was Nikki Haley in a burqa. So clearly tapping into both gender and racist tropes. So that gives you some sense of what it means when you're a woman candidate and the kinds of things that women candidates and women office holders are faced with when these kind of easy tropes are used, and also when these kind of stereotypes are played up, and when women candidates are not seen as serious because we're talking about their hairstyle or the length of their skirt, or the case of Hillary Clinton, we all remember Cleavage Gate, where an enormous amount of coverage was given to her and the fact that she wore a slight V-neck top. And then the multiple articles that came after the Washington Post wrote that very first piece. So I'm going to stop there so we have time for all of your other questions, and look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Debbie. Let's keep going on that vein. Sonya, you were in the newsroom at the AP, both for Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's runs. What is different? I mean, let's talk about the differences now that journalists need to consider. You know, we've had a multiracial man, we've had a white woman. Now we have, for the first time, a multiracial woman who is leading a major party ticket. What do journalists need to be mindful of?
Thank you for that question, Anne, and for the good background that Debbie provided on this particular situation. It is the difference this time is more of the same, and there needs to be recognition of the fact that for women of color, there is duality. We are both our race and our gender. And it is patently unfair to expect us to choose one or the other. That pressure to choose one or the other plays out in politics more often than people know. And usually we are pressed to choose our race over our gender in almost every situation. This was the case with Barack Obama's 2008 campaign, when many of the Black women who are elected officials had already committed to Hillary Clinton. And there was deep pressure from within the Black community for Black women to embrace and endorse Obama. And having to make that value judgment was a big concern. And then in 2019, there was similar pressure, but the pressure that time was, you can't ride with Kamala Harris on this. She's not going to get elected. You need to put your support where the Democratic Party can win, because Donald Trump must be defeated. And her candidacy then, Kamala Harris's candidacy then, was treated as if you are somehow failing your race or your people if you choose her. Many of the people you see out here right now, who were among the earliest endorsers of the Harris-Walsh ticket, even before it became a Harris-Walsh ticket, were original supporters of Kamala Harris in 2018, 2019, and 2020. So it's not surprising whenever we are confronted with, you must choose. And it will continue to be the case. That is what I expect as an African-American woman. That is what Donald Trump is alluding to with his attacks on Kamala Harris's multiracial presence in this race, and her choice, her identity choice as an African-American woman somehow must be questioned. Her identity choice to embrace her Indian heritage somehow must be questioned, right? By the same people who said to her, you are not this, you are that. You are Black or you are Indian, and now they want to define her or make her choose. So that force of choice is something that journalists have to be cognizant of in questioning people through this process. It is easier for men of color to choose their gender and their race at the same time, but it is not the same for us.
Thank you. And I do want to come back to the question of how the media covers electability, but before we get too far, I do want to make sure that we can get to Sameea. So obviously, I mean, and this is an issue that comes up anytime that there are guidelines or tips that come out for journalists and newsrooms. I know as well as you do that, you know, we can talk about it all day long, but when the rubber meets the road and you are on deadline, how do you actually apply this kind of thing when, you know, time is so tight, there's not enough reporters to cover all the news that's coming out?
Yeah, I think, excuse me, some of it is, I think, being proactive and habit building before you get to the breaking news story. So a lot of the work that I do is enterprise reporting. And in that process, I will, you know, reach out to people and I will do the step. I used to do the step at the end of the story where I'm looking it over. I'm like, did I miss any perspectives? Is there someone important who's, you know, or an angle or perspective I left out? And then towards the end of the story, I'm like, shoot, I have to turn this in at the end of the day. Like, it's too late for me to, you know, talk to enough people. And so through that, I learned to do that earlier in the process. And so even when I'm on deadline, when I'm on a quick turn story, I have learned to kind of do that earlier in the process. So I do think there is, it's just like a habit that you have to kind of create over time. But I think these conversations are really helpful with Debbie and Sonya, the context, because I think the awareness of it is so important going into the story, like being aware of this historical context. And yeah, just to piggyback, I think I've been thinking about, like, I know that the current race feels different. I know that we are covering things a little bit differently, but we're not doing it, you know, not to say that we're doing it better. There's just like a different conversation. I think, Sonya, the way you put it, the duality is definitely something I'm thinking a lot about.
I'd like to go, so Sameea, continue with you, but also add Sonya into this, you know, because obviously you are also a journalist. So how have you gone about kind of growing, you know, one of the things that we talk about in the guidelines is making sure that you have women sources, women experts in a whole variety of fields, and not just kind of the in front of the camera folks, but also behind the scenes. Obviously, having those folks on speed dial is really helpful when, you know, things actually go down. I'm trying to avoid saying any bad words right now. So how have you gone about growing your source list? What are some tips that you would give to other journalists?
Well, I would say, first of all, every process has women in the background. So just go straight to the back and look at who's back there making things happen, because typically those are better sources than the ones who are out front. That was my approach as a White House reporter. I you know, felt there was always going to be a crush and a rush to push you aside to get to the you know, the big-headed journalists were always going to run for the highest ranking source. So I defaulted and pulled back and said, okay, let me move this curtain. Who's back here? Because that's where usually the women are. And that was the case in the Clinton White House. That was the case in the Bush White House. I would hazard a guess it's even the case in the Biden White House. And it's not that it's sinister per se. That's just usually the way it goes. This was the case with the civil rights movement. You had a large number of men out front, but if you pull that curtain back, there are a lot of women back there who are just as knowledgeable and can give you information, and usually are untapped as sources. So most of the time, you know, it became, how'd you get that information? How'd you know that? Talk to the women. We weren't out playing golf with the president at the time, you see.
Smart. And Sameea, you are not in Washington. So how are you covering things on, I know obviously you have a whole state to worry about, but a bit more of a local angle.
Yeah, well, I do use CAWP quite a bit. They're great to rely on. The data is always like very straightforward and everything. I think like another strategy, and we do have some like the NPR diverse sources database linked in the tip sheet. But I think asking, sometimes you have a very specific question and you feel like there's only like certain people who can answer it. But I have found that asking the people in front, like who else should I talk to, that has bared a lot of fruit for me. Where sometimes it's professors who have like PhD students who have looked into a very specific topic or have spent a lot of time studying something, and I feel like that's kind of the moment we're in of trying to bring more people up beyond the usual source list, and that's often where I find like more diverse sources. But in terms of general coverage, yeah, we're just trying to, at CalMatters, we focus on California politics and policy. And so I think the value add that we've been trying to provide is what Kamala Harris's background has been in California. And I think that it ties a little bit back to, it's not the idea of electability, but, in 2020, when she ran for president, there was a lot of, this was, during the protests after the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of attention on her like role as a prosecutor, as the attorney general. And so I think we've just been kind of watching how this time is different. Like, and in some ways it feels like progress because we're not talking about like her personality, we're kind of talking about her record. But that said, of course, as the other panelists mentioned, there are still these issues of coverage that sometimes it's a question of like, is it fair to cover this? What do we amplify? What do we not amplify? I think we saw that a lot during the 2016 and 2020 elections with Donald Trump. Like, which of the comments do you sort of give more attention to? So I think those are the kinds of issues that we will be grappling with for the next few months.
Thank you. And Debbie, let's go back to you for a second on the electability issue. Do you think that the way the media covers electability, does the media make assumptions, or are those issues backed up by polling numbers, by data?
Yeah, well, first of all, women do get elected. And so when this question comes up, that's in many ways always the first response, which is even at the presidential level, we saw that Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump did. Kamala Harris was elected to be vice president. We have seen a woman serve as Speaker of the House. We saw in 2018 when the House flipped from red to blue, it was because women ran and were electable and got elected. So we know that women are absolutely electable, but we know that this question about their electability becomes a real challenge, and in a way, a kind of a catch-22. So going back to the 2020 presidential election, but we were talking about earlier, where there was this kind of desperation on the part of Democrats to defeat Donald Trump. There was this notion that somehow, even though the Democrats had an incredibly, the most diverse field that we've ever seen for a presidential primary, the most women, people of color in the mix, even when people were asked, who are you supporting? They might say, oh, I'm supporting Amy Klobuchar. I really like Elizabeth Warren for this, or Kamala Harris would be terrific. They were reluctant and said, but I have to support Joe Biden because he's the only one who can win. And then that becomes a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it really has a huge impact on women candidates and candidates of color. We also see this in districts that are majority white districts where women of color will run, and the assumption is they can't win in those kinds of districts, that the only kinds of districts that women of color can win in are districts that have a majority people of color population. We know that's not the case. You can just look around and see. In where we are, where the center is New Jersey. Bonnie Watson Coleman, Congresswoman from New Jersey, is representing a far more diverse district, not majority minority district. Lauren Underwood in Illinois is another example. But this sort of mythology, this conventional wisdom about electability makes it much harder for women of color to run in more places. And where we really see that being a challenge is when they're running statewide, either for the United States Senate or for governor. And it's not for nothing that we've never seen a Black woman governor. It is this kind of story that keeps getting told, that keeps getting repeated, that makes it hard for those women of color to raise money, to get their name out there, to be viable, right? Because viability is measured by money. And if you can't raise the money, then you're not seen as viable. And if you're not seen as viable, you can't raise the money. So it becomes this cycle. So this electability myth keeps coming up and keeps getting in the way for women. And journalists could do a lot to change that by changing and switching up that narrative and really putting a spotlight on the clear examples where women of color can, in fact, be elected in places that the conventional wisdom says they can't, and to just really highlight the fact that women in general are, in fact, getting elected.
Now, a lot of the examples that have been mentioned so far have been Democratic women, but let's talk about Republican women for a minute. Of registered voters, 51% of women are or lean Democratic, and 44% Republican. And those numbers have not changed all that much since the 90s, which I think actually, if you asked people, out on the street, that might surprise them. How can reporters earn the trust of, conservative and independent women voters, so that they can be interviewed and their views represented in coverage? Obviously, we are seeing a distrust of the media, sort of broadly, but specifically amongst conservatives. And that question's for anyone, and I know it's a kind of a tricky one.
Well, I mean, if you take a look at the recent past, there are signs that they can get there as a party, they being the Republican Party. There was the rather startling, well, for the media anyway, election of Mia Love to Congress, and even the rise of Nikki Haley within the party suggests that potential is there. I looked at Nikki Haley's candidacy this time as having earmarks of Kamala Harris's campaign last time. And the potential is there for the Republican Party to do it. They've got their MAGA dilemma to deal with in terms of the ideological split within the party, but it is possible. On our radar screen, we do see Black women candidates emerging on the Republican side of the column. Right, I believe Virginia right now has a Black woman lieutenant governor. So the potential is there, and it's just going to take diligent attention to get at it, and the knowledge of the institutional knowledge about the history there, because it indeed is something that I actually see that evolving over time. The organization Higher Heights, which supports Black women candidates, are encouraging women candidates of color, to run for office. They've shown on their lists that they do have Black women Republican candidates among their roster. So it really might just simply be a matter of lack of media attention, and maybe there is a way to dig in there and handle the disinformation and misinformation, big lie challenges that come with that, come in along with that. The media might be able to uncover an untold story there.
Interesting. Debbie, in your research, have you found that Republican women face different obstacles or biases?
Well, if you look at the proportion of women within the Democratic caucus, for instance, in the House versus the women in the Republican caucus, there's a huge disparity. And women are in many states, half of or close to half of the Democratic caucus in their state legislature. Not the case in any state on the Republican side. So there is a real challenge that Republican women are facing out there. Part of it has to do with some infrastructure that exists for Democratic women. Financial support, training, the kind of work that's being done around the country. We also know that women are more likely to be Democrats. That's part of the challenge as well. But also the party itself, the Republican Party does not prioritize gender or race directly. In fact, the party really shuns the concept of identity politics, right? Not seeing kind of that notion that everybody can run, everyone can throw their hat into the ring, and the best candidate will rise. And if it happens to be a woman or a person of color, that's great. But we're not going to do the kind of work that has been done on the Democratic side to prioritize race and gender and that kind of and those sorts of differences. You know, when you ask the question about reaching and the sort of the rank and file and getting the trust of Republican voters as journalists, I think one of the challenges y'all face is that on the right, particularly within the kind of MAGA movement, right, there is this discrediting of mainstream media. So it kind of feeds this notion that none of you can really be trusted. And so I do think y'all face a real challenge of how can you gain the trust of folks to include them as sources if at the same time much of the rhetoric out of the party is that, you know, you can't be trusted. And so I'm actually kind of curious how you handle that. Like how do you get yourselves sources and people who are willing to talk to you if they're also thinking of you as part of the problem?
Sameea, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, and we also have to have this on the tip sheet, but it's just avoiding the typecasting, I think is so important in this regard and many others where, you know, I remember going to a California Republican Party convention, and this was before the it was after the 2020 election. But, you know, I met one woman who sort of agreed with everything the Democratic Party said except abortion. And she, you know, had particular concerns from just a religious viewpoint. And so we had a long conversation. And so, you know, I think like conversations like that, like, you know, checking your assumptions at the door, don't assume that you know everything about a person or that you understand their belief system from like one thing about them. And like doing the work of getting out to people in different places, I think that is probably the biggest thing that we can do is, yeah, checking our assumptions at the door. I mean, I remember there's this exercise that we do in journalism school where you interview a classmate and then they write something about you. So I remember my classmate had written about me, like, despite her cultural upbringing, you know, her family supported her education. I was like, what? Like, those are not, you know, it's not either or. People are a lot of ands, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
People are a lot of ands. That is very, very true. Before we continue, we have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to just remind the participants that we have. We're glad that you're here, and if you would like to submit a question for any of the panelists, please feel free to do so. You can type one in and we will get to that. I also wanted to go back. So obviously we have been talking a lot about Vice President Harris today for obvious reasons. But what other, that's kind of where everyone's attention is and certainly will be in November. But what other races, in which women are running are kind of on your radar right now? What else is really kind of interest to you that you're going to be paying attention to? And again, this can be for any of the panelists.
Well, I just want to say that we did a briefing earlier this summer. It was pre-Kamal, it was just when Joe Biden had said he was not going to run. So whenever that was, it feels like a year ago, but I think that was a few weeks ago. Right. And we'll be doing those briefings again through the election cycle, just to kind of keep people up to date on where things are with women candidacies at other levels, because I think it is important to remember that while this is significant and important and history making, and there are also lots of women running up and down the ballot in races that are also significant, particularly at the state legislative level, where we know so much policy that matters, particularly in women's lives right now, is going to be made. But I'm just going to, I'd love to share a couple of the races that we talked about in our briefing. One that I think is sort of a real milestone. Sarah McBride, a Democrat in Delaware, is poised to become the first transgender woman in Congress. And what we're seeing in Maryland, Angela Also Brooks is poised to become the first Black woman elected statewide in Maryland. And along with Lisa Blunt Rochester, Democrat from Delaware, who is likely going to be the senator from the state of Delaware, there will be, for the very first time, at least 2 Black women serving simultaneously in the United States Senate, which is kind of wild to think that it's in 2024 and we're kind of stunned at the idea that there could be 2 Black women, and that would be a first, but it would be. We are seeing in North Dakota, Julie Fedorchak, who is probably likely to become the first woman to represent the state of North Dakota in the U.S. House of Representatives. And we're going to be watching a number of races where incumbent women in the House and in the Senate are more vulnerable. And what will happen there on this? There are quite a few on the House side, but in the Senate side, I would say the race in Nevada with Jackie Rosen, and in Wisconsin with Tammy Baldwin. So those are just some of the races.
Thank you. And Sonya, it looked like you were going to jump in there too.
Yes, I was. I was about to say that we are paying very close attention to both Angela Also Brooks and Lisa Blunt Rochester for the reasons that Debbie cited there. We also are watching a few candidates. We keep a list, and we're watching a few candidates who have since fallen off the radar because they did not win their Democratic primaries. And so for us, it is a win-lose proposition in terms of who didn't make it for a statewide race. And this is something that Black women have been processing for quite some time, ever since really, the most prominent one was Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial bids. But it's a wound licking that Black women have grown accustomed to and are using that to steal for the next fight. You have to remember there was a lot of wound licking around Kamala Harris's first presidential bid. And one reason that the Black women were able to get information so fast right after Biden stepped aside is because they were already ready to step in should the Democratic Party decide they wanted to dispose of the entire ticket. And there was strategy in place for that. So this is not a new rodeo for us. This is not our first time at this rodeo. And so we are also keeping up with who didn't make it. There were multiple candidates in the Democratic Senate primary in Tennessee, for example. And we took note of there were several Black women candidates in that race, and we are keeping up with them to see what they do next. That's a journalistic follow-up and can be quite a good GPS system for journalists. Go back and see what became of the ones who ran and then didn't make it. Do they come back again, or do they throw their hands up and say, I'm not doing that again? And if so, why? So we are surveying the entire landscape, in other words.
Yeah, that's smart. And also sort of a follow the money thing again, too, that we got back to.
Right.
Great. Well, going back to the guidelines just for a second, I know, we mentioned that it's kind of divided into, sourcing, language, and framing. I don't know if you've all had, Sameea, I know you did, but I don't know if you've all had a chance to kind of look through it. But is there something from those guidelines that, if there's one thing for journalists to take away that you would kind of encourage them to really keep in mind, particularly this election cycle?
I would actually pick a couple things. I think they're great. Sameea, I'm glad that you all worked on this. This is terrific. One is this idea, I think you listed as avoiding tokenism, but you talk about particularly the monolithic approach. And I think that's so important when we're looking at women in politics, this kind of assumption that when you just say women, you're kind of covering everyone. So women are clearly not monolithic. Make sure you're looking at the variation and the diversity by race and ethnicity, but party ideology, even ideology within a party. I mean, there's not a monolithic Democratic woman or a monolithic Republican woman, and really remembering that. And then you also have that the idea of watching out for loaded words. And I think I kind of talked about that at the beginning, which is, really kind of checking yourself about, am I using a word here that I would also use for a woman candidate as I would for a man who's running for office, and trying to be consistent there and really noticing those things and noticing even how you talk about family or personality. Like, are we talking about those things in the same kind of way for men and for women? So those were two that really stuck out for me.
Thank you.
I think for me, it's probably the framing question is when we're talking about gender, why are we talking about it? Centering it for good reason. I think like as journalists, we look out for an angle. Sometimes we try to bring the unique angle, but just asking ourselves like if it has value.
Mm-hmm. Sonya, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, not really, because they've covered the whole terrain here.
Yeah, no problem. We do have a question here from Beatrice Peterson of ABC News. She asks, do you all see a rise of interest among around lower tiered female candidates, congressional, state, and local, with Vice President Kamala Harris on the top of the ticket?
Well, on our end of things, that interest was there before Kamala Harris hit the top of the ticket. This has been an ongoing thing. And frankly, the reason that Black Women Unmuted exists, we first noticed it in a burst with the Democratic candidacy of Doug Jones in Alabama's Senate race, where he defeated Roy Moore with extreme participation by Black women voters. And what followed, which is not very well chronicled in media, is a rush of Black women running for office in Alabama. A lot of them did not get elected, but there was a lot of interest. So we began to pay attention then. And over time, it turned into, all of a sudden, we saw an emergence of multiple Black women getting elected as mayors. What we are seeing with the most recent midterm and the special elections of last year, more Black women got elected as mayor. Multiple Black women were elected to city councils, to school boards. And there are numerous Black women who are running for a statewide office largely in the South. There are Black women who are running for state house seats. If you look at the most recent election in Virginia, and how many Black women were elected there, you can honestly see a clear growth of interest among women. This predates Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, so we can only expect there'll be even greater enthusiasm for Black women candidates, and any victory that may come with Black women getting elected to the Senate satisfies an appetite that was there all along and is going to whet the appetite for additional victories at the statewide level.
Mm. We also have a question here from Dariana Davis from the 19th. The Tennessee Senate race and a significant number of competing, including the incumbent, was mentioned. What advice do you have for covering long shot candidates or people running in places where they're likely to lose for a variety of reasons?
One thing that we've done at CalMatters in the past is doing like a story dedicated to kind of the long shot candidates. And a part of the reason for that was explaining to people like why the media sees some candidates as like not having a chance, what that's based on, breaking down the fundraising numbers, the like polling. So I feel like there's an opportunity for like explaining sometimes, like inside politics speak through those candidates.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's important to still cover those candidates. I know that it's not possible to cover them at the same way that you would someone, in a very highly competitive race. But what's important about it is I think what Sonya was talking about earlier, which is what happens to them afterwards. We actually keep track of what we call our rebound candidates, right? Folks that didn't get elected the first time, and then you watch and see what they do next time. And sometimes you can run in a long shot race, and then resurface running for something else where you're not quite such a long shot. And you've gained some experience, you've gained some name recognition, and maybe the party might actually owe you a little something because you ran in a race where they needed a candidate. So I think paying attention to those long shot candidates is important. I would also say that as journalists, when there's an opening for a seat and lists start to come out of who are potential candidates to run for something, I would hope that journalists would take an extra look at women, and particularly women of color, to add them to that list, because sometimes just being on that list is significant and important, not necessarily for that particular race, but for a race down the road. We're seeing that actually in the state of New Jersey right now. A Latina woman, Patricia Campos, who ran for the United States Senate, lost to Andy Kim. But now that there is an opening, her name is being pushed forward in a very real way as the person that Governor Murphy should pick to take that seat. I don't think her name would have been in the mix had she not run for that Senate seat earlier.
And I liked, thank you. I liked how you and Sonya echoed each other, and Sonya's framing of kind of looking at those failed candidates and following them, and it sort of being like a GPS system. You see where they were, where things are going.
And we never call them failed candidates. We call them
I
candidates
apologize.
that didn't get elected the first time.
Yes, not the first time. There's always another round. We are out of time, but before everyone goes, I do have an exciting announcement, which is that as part of the Pivotal Ventures sponsorship, the National Press Foundation is excited to offer an award for excellent journalism coverage of women in politics. The award is not yet open. It will be open soon. So if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, which is in the chat, please do so. It will be announced there, or you can check back at nationalpress.org, and we will keep that award entry period open until after the election, and that will be for a $5,000 award. And it's open to any U.S. journalists. So we do hope to see some folks, hopefully, who tuned in today applying, and that you'll share it with your newsrooms. I would like to thank our panelists. This has been a really wonderful discussion, and I appreciate you all for joining and sharing your expertise. And thank you to Pivotal Ventures for supporting this fellowship.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.